know if you know this, Mark,
Go on.
but there are a lot of people of Irish extraction here in these United States of America.
Okay. Are there?
Yes, myself and my gigantic family being amongst them.
Right. Help me out with this of Irish extraction. How far back Irish are we talking? And how far back do you have to be to stop being able to claim that you are in fact Irish?
Well, you've kind of stumbled upon something that is like very specific to the United States when it comes to ethnicity in
Yeah.
general. We
Yeah.
don't wear it out. You take it with you, basically. I mean, there's some people who are so many mixes of like white that
Mm.
eventually they just kind of like, ah, I'm a mutt or whatever, like they stop like keeping track because like everyone intermarried. But groups like the Irish
Yes.
didn't intermarry I mean, like a whole lot. They stayed amongst themselves.
Kept it
So,
Irish.
yeah. So, like,
See,
until
my
my generation in my
my dear
family,
departed grandma, just super quickly, she
yeah.
I don't really believe her, but she told me once when I was a kid that if you go back like five or six grandparents, great great grandparents, whatever, we're of Russian descent, right?
Interesting. Okay.
I do not think of myself as Russian, not even a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And I think the thing is so it has like a lot to do with kind of like how we separated, like and enclaved out when people immigrated here, right?
Okay.
So like there's like the people who came like on the Mayflower and things like that, and they were like British and whatever. And over time, like they had no reason to stick to marrying other British people or other Dutch people or like whatever the case may be.
There was
Um,
options, there were choices.
yeah, it was just kind of like, are we all the same kind of Christian? Cool. Then we
Yeah.
all marry each other.
Let's get it
Uh
on.
where like other groups, especially Catholic groups, but like other groups in America tended to end up sort of pushed into areas where they lived with each other and they stayed with that group for various reasons.
It makes sense.
So until my generation in my family, like no one had ever married someone that wasn't Irish.
Huh.
And then like my dad's generation, there's like us, obviously he married a black woman, and there's like my cousins are half Japanese, I have a half Italian set of cousins, like that
So when
generation
right,
suddenly intermarried.
so when you say you're Irish, you're plausibly Irish. You're like one
Oh,
generation
yeah,
removed.
yeah.
Fine.
Exactly. Yeah, and
I'll
I would
allow
say
it.
like yeah, for a lot of us that is pretty much the case, like up
Hmm.
until recent history, you would have kind of stayed within that. But like, you know, America is different than Europe when it comes to this kind of stuff because like we're not from here, right? Like unless you're
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay,
indigenous,
okay,
you
okay,
didn't
okay.
come from this landmass. And so we tend to sort of like hang on to those identities in ways that like people in Europe don't do it. You're just like, where do you live? You're that thing, or at least for until, you get like unless you
Do you
are
know that makes a
actually an
lot of
immigrant.
sense? That makes perfect sense. Yes.
Right.
I,
So
I, my, my great great grandparents didn't settle here from anywhere.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, there's not really any like cultural grounding in if there is some Russian back in your
Hmm.
family, it's not a part of who you are. Whereas here we tend to sort of retain those identities. Um,
I bet you if I fucking spat on the stick and sent it off to 23andMe or whatever, there's zero fucking Russian. I don't know why she would say that. I
I
don't
know
believe
that's
it.
such a funny
It
that's a
is.
funny thing to say.
She even fucking hell, now we're dredging memories. She even mentioned a name. She said Tilitsky was the old Russian family name.
That's
I
very
mean,
specific.
isn't it? What a fucking strange thing to lie about. I don't believe a word of it.
Well, I'm sure she wasn't lying. There must be some reason she thinks that. But every family has like mythology too, right? Like there's
Yeah,
always
that's
things
true.
that like your family hands down about themselves
Mm,
that it's like no one can verify this, but we've been saying it for so long that at this
yeah.
point it becomes true. Like in my family, and to be fair, there's a chance this is still true, but like we've always thought that we were part Native American. And when I did the 23andMe thing, like that didn't come up. Now, part of this also, like, Welsh didn't come up, and I'm clearly Welsh. Like, my last name is Vaughn. Uh, but like, so there's certain areas that they don't like have enough DNA for, or they homogenize, right?
I
So
see.
if
I
you
see.
23andMe specifically will not tell you you're Welsh. It will tell you you're
Yes.
Irish or English. Um,
But it won't tell you
and
you're Welsh.
it won't tell you you're Welsh. You could
Oh,
do
whoa, whoa,
23andMe.
whoa,
Me.
whoa, whoa, whoa.
It will not tell you you're Welsh. It will say you are from the British Isles.
I kind of feel
Isn't
a little
that
bit
crazy?
slighted.
Yeah, it's bananas. Ancestry will tell you this. Ancestry
Uh-huh.
will give you Welsh. Like most of the other ones will, but for whatever reason, 23andMe does not do that.
Fascinating. How do you know this?
Because I
Because you
Googled it
did it.
after a while.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like I
Okay.
was like, everything like points to the fact that I should have Welsh in me. And that's weird. And so I just kind of looked and was
Oh, you
like,
know how hard I'm biting my tongue right now.
shut up. You know what I mean. But anyways, I Googled and
Ooh.
it was like, yeah, 23andMe does not test for Welsh and will not
Mm.
tell you you're from there. So just FYI, if you ever decide to give your DNA to the data mining companies, don't do
Yeah.
23andMe because they won't tell you where you're from. Except you might
Fascinating.
find out you're Russian.
Mm. Okay.
But anyways, all that to say, yeah, Irish Americans, there are a lot of us here. And the thing about Irish Americans is, while we like basically invented St. Patrick's Day and we love our specific culture that we've created here, the vast majority have no fucking clue about the actual history of
So
Ireland.
St. Patrick's Day is an American Irish creation.
It is the
Fuck.
feast. I know
4
you're
minutes
already
in
learning,
and
right? Look at how much you're learning.
oh,
The feast of St. Patrick is a Catholic holiday.
yeah.
St. Patrick's Day,
Yeah.
as it has like become, was actually created by Irish Americans in the 1700s, specifically as a protest against Britain.
And you the big foam green top hats with the clover on, you did that as
That's
well?
ours. We did
Ah,
this.
so cool.
I know, right? Good job, Irish Americans. um, but yes, despite all of that, we Irish Americans don't know a whole lot about Irish history. We're like very into being Irish, but like
Yes.
no interest in knowing what that means from a historical perspective.
Hmm.
And as such, the Irish are amongst the worst subsets of white Americans. They're often anti-immigrant, pro-cop,
Yeah.
racist,
Yeah.
and they justify it with things like, oh, there used to be no Irish need apply signs on shops back in the day, or with like
Mm.
myths about how the Irish were slaves, which is not true, but you ask a white Irish person and they will tell you that that was totally a thing. And
Yeah,
they just
Indestructible Mike from the other fucking week. He was an Irish settler, wasn't he? He was an Irish immigrant.
indestructible Mike.
Dave the fuck Mike the fucking durable. You remember the fucking geezer who
Oh,
could not be
yes.
killed him?
Right. Yes, exactly.
Indestructible Mike.
I remember this now.
Mm.
Yeah. And so they sort of completely remove the history of Irish like oppression so that they can't see how the same things that were visited upon them are visited upon others. And the story I'm going to tell you is about the sort of accidental way that the Irish became white. And Lord, we have had to suffer as a result.
Hmm.
Now, since, as I said, Irish Americans know next to nothing about Ireland other than potatoes, drinking, fighting,
Of
I'm
course.
gonna I'm gonna provide a backdrop of why people didn't stay there. Because any of us who have been to Ireland love it. I don't think there's an Irish American alive who hasn't fantasized about dual citizenship and making a home there. It's a
Mm.
gorgeous place. So why did our ancestors piece the fuck out of the Emerald Isle to live in crowded tenements in places like grimy 19th century New York City where everyone looked down on them and treated them like shit?
A
The
good
short
question.
answer, the British. The Brits and the
I
Irish
might have
didn't
known.
Right? It's like how everything in this country comes back to Reagan.
Yeah.
Like if you go other places, it just comes back to the Brits. The Brits and the Irish didn't always live in hostility with one another. In fact, for many centuries, they coexisted quite well, intermarrying with each other and living peacefully, even in the more clannish days before and after the Viking and Norman invasions of Ireland between the 7th and 11th centuries. Brits were happy to just meld right into Irish society. But that all changed at the beginning of the 17th century when the English and the Scottish started creating Protestant settlements in Ulster, which is now, of course, part of Northern Ireland and still part of the United Kingdom. These Protestant settlers didn't just set up a little spot for their clan to live, but instead straight up confiscated the Gaelic Catholics' land. And
Mm.
this was a new kind of invasion compared to the ones of the past. The British Protestants not only saw Irish Catholics as a separate race, they saw them as an inferior race and initiated a full scale genocide on the orders of one Oliver Cromwell, Lord
Mm.
Protector of the Commonwealth. Real rat bastard, and perhaps the greatest villain in a long line of them in Ireland's
Yes.
struggle. In 1690, the Irish were defeated at the Battle of the Boyne, and Britain went on to subjugate them in every way possible, including barring them from public office and the legal profession, preventing them from getting education, keeping them from owning land, and perhaps most egregious to the people at the time, limiting their right to practice their religion. This, of course, is why the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 20th
Of
century tend
course.
to get minimized and boiled down to a religious conflict. It's not a religious conflict. It's a colonial entity occupying an indigenous population and severely limiting their rights. But one of those rights happens to be their right to practice religion, and a defining difference between the ruling group and the oppressed group is the religion. And it doesn't help that centuries later, Protestants in Northern Ireland still parade through Catholic neighborhoods in what are known as orange marches to
Yes.
really rub their faces in the fact that they conquered them back in the day and now they're Brits. And that there are still Protestant and Catholic sections of town tells you a whole lot about how effective the segregation was. They have a power sharing government now, but it's very new and it hasn't solved the divide between those who still think the crown is cool and those that want to see a united Ireland. But the point is, what Britain did in Ireland is the same exact thing they did to Indigenous people in North America and in their other colonies around the world. In fact, Ireland is considered to be the first British colony. And the Go ahead.
Well, we've got something like 8 months left before the Great Irish Reunification
I
of
know.
2024, according to Commander Data, of course.
And how wild is it that they ended up with like a Sinn Féin member
Yep.
leading Stormont now? Like, what the?
You know, that episode
Is it
was
happening?
not shown over here for fucking oh, I'm absolutely full on
No.
serious. That episode of Star
Really?
Trek: The Next Generation was not shown on the BBC when they played Next Gen for the first time because of the political implications of that one fucking line. That was
That
known as,
is
oh, for
wild.
real. That was like a lost episode, and it's only very recently has that episode seen the light of day over here.
Mark, I had no idea.
True story. I will hook you up. I'll link you up.
Yeah, that's bananas. I
Hmm.
love that. I mean, I don't love that, but I love that as like a fact. I didn't know
Yes.
that that was a thing. And that, I mean, boy, doesn't that get to the heart of this, right? Like
Oh,
we're
completely. Yes,
talking
it does.
about
Yes, it
30
does.
years ago that it was like we can't even air this on the television because this
Yes.
might rile people so badly. Bananas. Um, so uh the Irish were displaced from their homes by the British, often then just like given a little plot of land that they then had to pay the landlord for, who was now living in their house. As Livia Gershon put it in the JSTOR Daily, quote, in both parts of the world, as in North America and here, I mean, North America and Ireland, Britain used techniques including religious suppression, apartheid style division, and well organized violence to gain access to land and its products. In the process, it expelled local people from their land. During the Irish potato famine, which I'll get to, a crisis caused largely by British policies that forced Irish farmers to grow crops for export,
Oh, yeah,
the
it wasn't a famine
empire's
at all.
right, yeah. The empire sent families on dangerous coffin ships to North America. In Canada, it pushed indigenous people onto small reserves or into urban areas. So like I said, I'll get into the potato famine in a minute, but like
Mm.
this sort of point being that like the same colonization techniques were used in Ireland that have later been visited upon other colonies, that ones that we very, recognize like oh, that was a shitty thing that we did to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Again, I'd say most Irish Americans don't know that the exact same thing was visited upon Ireland first, and they
Yeah.
don't see those parallels.
The Canadian colonialism that you speak of is what I've just finished reading about, in fact.
In
Doppelganger,
Doppelganger.
yes. Hmm.
Yes, which we will also talk
Mm.
about when we get the pod started. But horrible stuff, and this is the testing ground for that was Ireland. Aziz Rahman, Mary Ann Clark, and Sean Byrne point to Ireland as Britain's first colonial expansion and explain that its techniques were honed in its expanded colonization around the world. The point, they note, was to gain strategic military power, economic profit, and political power. And they got that by creating a brutal and violent system of apartheid that stripped the indigenous peoples of their rights down to the ability to speak their own native language. This is obviously true of Wales as well, and why
Yeah, yeah.
so many places now are fighting to bring back their indigenous languages. When you drive through Ireland or Wales, you notice that everything is in Gaelic or in Welsh and then translated into English. This isn't because most people in either of those countries speak the indigenous language, but a conscious effort to reclaim what the Brits tried to kill, which is working pretty well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they have done a very good job of revitalizing both Irish and Welsh in those places, and abroad with people like me. And the Irish have always been super in tune with their connection to other colonized people around the world. In fact, according to Gershon, during the 1916 Easter Rising, they made a point of calling attention to the similarities of their struggle to those of the people of Congo, Brazil, and Peru.
Wow.
Yeah, right? And we obviously see that now in Ireland's steadfast support for Palestine as the UK continues to fund the genocide there. Ireland has stood up and been like, absolutely not. And the Easter Rising itself is important because this was the moment that Irish rebels organized and attempted to put up resistance against the British troops who far outnumbered them, easily trounced them, and executed over a dozen of them, along with the nearly 500 people who were killed in the fighting, most of whom were civilians and many of which were kids. In one case, the British took a wounded rebel from the hospital, tied him to a chair, and executed him by firing squad. Real grim imagery, and not dissimilar to the incident in Palestine a few months ago, in which Israeli soldiers burst into a hospital and executed a paralyzed teenager they said was a Hamas operative. The parallels just keep playing out
Yeah,
over and
I
over.
mean, you I think you described it a few weeks back as a playbook,
Yes,
a
exactly.
colonization kind of playbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you absolutely see this stuff happening here.
Mm.
Victory wasn't the point of the Easter Rising, though. The violent and horrific response from the British enraged people in Ireland and abroad and galvanized the movement for Irish independence that led to the eventual creation of the Republic of Ireland, albeit with the partition of the 6 counties that make up Northern Ireland. But until then, life as an Irish Catholic was really, really hard and continued to be if you lived in Northern Ireland. And to add to the oppression, in the middle of the 19th century, they were hit with the aforementioned Great Famine. And this is a thing I think is not well understood by Americans. And I don't know if I can say the same for Brits. Like, do you think Brits really know what happened there? Do you know what happened there because you later looked into it, or
Uh,
is this
the
common
only
knowledge?
the only reason I know broadly the shape of it was because of Sinead O'Connor,
Ah,
right?
yes,
Um,
absolutely.
but no, broadly, I think it gets reduced to a stereotype, to an Irish stereotype.
What do you think? Like, if you went up to someone and were like, explain the potato famine or whatever, what would they say, do you think?
Oh, next to fuck all.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is not just Americans who would struggle with this, and that's by design, of course.
But
Um
yeah, I mean, often we've lamented that, oh man, what gets taught, is
yeah,
is isn't
maybe got
really
an
what people
agenda.
need to fucking know. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a product of that, you know?
Right, and the plus is that, of course, you're a curious enough person to want to know more than that. But,
Mm,
part of the problem is that a lot of people build their worldview around what
yes.
they know, and it isn't enough, you know? So basically, the Irish were living and working on plots of land now owned largely by Brits. And they'd rent out a small area on that land that they could use to grow food for themselves, or to sell at markets. And that would sort of supplement their meager incomes. And potatoes were very easy to grow, so they tended to dedicate most of the space to them, and then everything else would be for stuff they could sell. And listen, potatoes are a beautiful food of the gods, and we are lucky to have them.
Delicious,
But yeah, I
versatile.
fucking love a potato. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, don't worry. I'm just trying to think, is
Oh,
there
you're
a
just eating.
form of potato that I do not like? I don't think there is.
I think like there's things you can mix it with that would turn me off, but like the form of potato, I think it's
Sure, but
perfect
in
in
its
every
purest
form.
form, I mean, I think the probably the most refined and godlike and kind of ultimately engineered form of potato is the potato fondant. Have you seen those?
Yeah. Oh,
It's
no,
just
totally. That was what I was
fucking
thinking. Like when you
hell.
started to say the most refined, like that was what I was
High
imagining.
end all the way down to just fucking whacking a potato in the oven.
Yes. Or in the microwave for that matter.
Or in the
I
microwave, or in
do that
the
all the
air
time.
fryer, air fried
Mm-hmm.
baked potatoes. Son of a bitch.
Telling you, a near perfect food.
Just become to
But
life then when you
yeah, right. But there's sort of a misconception that the Irish are into potatoes as like a
Yeah, yeah,
cultural
yeah, yeah, yeah.
thing,
Yes, yes.
I guarantee you Catholics in Ireland in the 1800s were probably sick to death of potatoes, which
Oh
made up
yeah.
a huge part of their diet simply because it was all they could afford to grow and eat. And it's similar to, like, I don't know if you know this. Do you know what Americans eat on St. Patrick's Day?
Uh, I don't, but there's a fucking voice in my head saying like corned beef.
Yes.
Is that right?
You're correct.
Well,
Yes.
son of a bitch.
Corned beef and cabbage is the
Mm,
traditional St. Patrick's Day meal in America. And it is not Irish. It was what Irish Americans could afford to eat
yeah.
when they were, living, uh, you know, paycheck to paycheck in New York City in the 1800s. And they bought it from Jews. Like, this
Mm.
is a Jewish meal. And it has just become, this poverty food has become associated with Irish Americans, much like potatoes becoming associated with the Irish.
FYI, corned beef sandwiches, big taste of my youth.
Really?
Big. Well, let's just touch base here. What do you mean by corned beef?
Do I mean? Well, I did read what it is. It's some form of brine that they used that used salt, or yeah, it was like salt that was in a shape called corns. So
Okay.
they
Okay.
brine a beef, and that
Okay.
is called corned beef, and it's like pink, just like a
Yeah.
pink slab of beef.
Yes. So what I mean by corned beef is it will come in a tin,
Yeah, a lot of times it's definitely
open it with a
tinned.
key,
Mm-hmm.
peel off the bottom, and you'll get this cube of meat.
It's
Rawr. And it's got like lovely kind of fat on the outside, and you cut off a wedge of that shit, whack it between two slices of bread, loads of butter, glass of Diet Coke.
ugh.
Welcome to Tradiga.
It's horrific.
Beautiful.
I even
I
like
could eat that
listen.
right now. Bag of
I've
crisps.
said I've said before, Keo had corned beef for dinner when we went to the pub.
Mm.
I've said before that I was like a huge meat eater my entire life. Loved meat, and even when I was eating tons and tons of meat, corned
You've
beef
been to the
was a
pub
big no.
today, haven't you?
I have, yeah.
You've been drinking.
It's St. Patrick's. No, I haven't been drinking.
Oh,
Sober
okay.
2024.
Oh, of course, yes.
I had a Shirley Temple,
Okay.
which was interesting. My first like St. Patrick's Day since I was probably like 22 that I had no
Oh,
drinks at
lovely.
all.
Nice.
Keo had a couple Guinnesses. I had a Shirley Temple. Life was good. um, but yeah, so that is to say, potatoes are not like a cultural Irish thing, except
No.
that they were making do with what they could get, and the rest of their produce would be sold at markets, while other crops like grain would be exported out of Ireland. But in 1845, Ireland was hit by a devastating fungal potato blight called Phytophthora infestans, or
Yes.
P. infestans,
Yep.
that took out a third to half of the year's crop. and by the next year, 3/4 of the crop failed. This would last 6 years and kill about 1 million people through a combination of starvation, disease, and poverty. And the British government pretty much just let it happen. For 6 months, they had a cheap and efficient soup kitchen scheme that fed millions of Irish people every single day. But then, inexplicably, they just stopped doing that. And they continued exporting the food that could have been used to feed the people there
Mm.
because, duh, money. They should have obviously said, you can't export this stuff anymore. You need to feed the people here. Much more important than those gross Catholics was the money. On top of these direct famine problems, the government did nothing to stop the landlords from evicting their suffering tenants. And according to the BBC, 500,000 people were evicted from their homes between 1846 and 1854. And as a result, between 1 to 2 million Irish people fled Ireland, many of whom ended up at the feet of Lady Liberty right here in the US of A. Not literally, because she wasn't built until the 1880s, but figuratively
Yes,
at the
yes, yes.
feet of Lady Liberty. Now, just to give like some bonkers context here, the population of the Republic of Ireland now is about 5.5 million.
Fuck.
So, yeah, we're looking at like a
Fuck.
fifth of today's population having fled in the 1800s, not to mention equally as many having died.
Mm.
And, half of that, then on top of that, also having been like evicted. So, like, that's a lot of people in
It's
a
huge.
small country either dying or leaving as a
Yep.
result of this famine. And of course, then, after that, even more Irish people left in the early 20th century to get away from all the persecution and poverty once Ellis Island opened up here, and we had a nice little gateway for European immigrants to come through. So, according to the US Census in 2020, there are now nearly 39 million Irish Americans in the US. There are 34 million more Irish Americans
Than they were in the
than there
first
are
place.
Irish people
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on the island of Ireland. We outnumber our folks back home by a landslide. This, of course, is helped along by families like my dad's. He was one of 11 kids, and this wasn't abnormal for his neighborhood. By the time my dad was growing up in Orange, New Jersey in the 1950s, Irish Americans were part of the respectable white middle class. His dad had served in World War II and came back with that GI Bill money to set his family up in the suburbs outside New York City, after initially having my dad and his older siblings in Brooklyn. They were living the American dream. But this wasn't always what it was like to be Irish in America. You see, Marko, whiteness is not actually a skin color. It's a political construction. It's a class construction. And when the Roman Catholics of Europe first immigrated to the United States, they were not politically white, despite what
Mm.
their skin might have told you.
Mm.
The race of Irish people was Irish.
Yes.
Italians were Italian. Poles were Polish, at least on the East Coast. On the West Coast, those lines were a little fuzzier because these Europeans were working alongside Mexicans and Chinese people as opposed to just other Europeans. So there was a hierarchy. Europeans of any background got better jobs and pay, while Mexican and Chinese labor got the worst and most dangerous jobs and were paid the least to do them. So whether or not the Irish were classed as white, per se, they enjoyed at least some status above the more obviously ethnically different folks. For East Coast Christians, though, the main divide was Protestant or Catholic, and the dominant Protestants didn't think too highly of those weird papists.
Super quickly,
Mm-hmm.
obvious kind of vocal tells aside,
Mm.
how else would an Irish settler be marked as out as Irish?
That's a good question. I mean, like I said, America was very ethnically segregated.
Mm.
So I mean, it would be very difficult for you to hide something like an accent,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it
yeah.
would have been from where you grew up. Probably what you ate gave you
Mm.
away, your family gave you away, and your name. I mean, if
Yeah,
you
okay,
didn't
yes,
change your
yes, of course,
name,
of course.
you
Yeah.
know, everyone's gonna be like, yeah, Seamus Murphy, like he's from,
Brooklyn.
London. Like,
Yeah.
you can tell where the guy's from.
Fair.
Uh, so yeah, I'm sure there were plenty of people who like passed one way or another,
Yeah, that's
people who
that's what I was
learned
kind of
to,
wondering. Yeah.
yeah, but if you're like a working class person, what opportunity do you really have to try to like pass as a,
Mm.
as a different kind of European? That takes some degree of privilege to be able to do.
Or a vocal
Um,
coach.
vocal coach, yeah. Like, you know, it'd be tricky. Uh, but so like I said, Protestants were skeptical of papists, and there's a reason Joe Biden is only our second Catholic president. Americans have historically been wary of people taking orders from some guy in Rome. They think that that's going to be the like your priority as opposed to doing what's best for the nation. And in 19th century New York, Protestants would legit snag Irish Catholic kids off the street and essentially kidnap them into Protestant care homes, a thing they were allowed to do due to a law about kids being found not in school during the day. It was like basically like a form of
Well,
vagrancy.
free kids.
Free kids. Yeah. And it's pretty crazy considering a lot of kids had to like work in factories and stuff. So of
Yeah, yeah,
course
yeah,
they
yeah,
weren't
yeah.
in school. But
Hang on.
obviously, yeah.
Ugh. A law that states a kid who isn't in school and is roaming around, possibly at work or whatever, is no one's kid. He's like a kind of a
Well,
communal
no,
kid.
it's more like they can be basically like thrown into like
Right, right,
juvenile
right, right,
delinquent
right, right, right. Fine, fine, fine. Okay,
homes or
okay.
whatever. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not
yeah,
that
yeah.
it's like this is my kid now. It's like they
Yeah.
can be put into a home, they can be put into
Got you.
care
Care of the
as a
state. Okay.
result. Yes,
Mm,
exactly. And so Protestants took advantage of that to just straight up like kidnap Catholic kids
mm.
at the time. Um, and the law was obviously a punitive law. The point wasn't that they cared about kids' education and wanted what was best for them. It was about punishing and controlling classes of people they felt were undesirable. For Catholics, it was important that their children, even their orphans, be raised Catholic and not snatched up by Protestants. Thus, in 1904, 40 Irish Catholic orphans from the Foundling Hospital in New York were loaded on a train headed west for Arizona, where the nuns that had been caring for them had arranged with the French-born priest Father Constant Mondin for the kids to be taken in by parishioners at his church. The Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Clifton was, however, a Mexican church. Having no context for America's weird racial fuckery, Mondin was like, I've vetted a bunch of families from this church who are very moral and upstanding and stable and can totally take these kids and raise them as good Catholics. Done and done. And indeed, that wasn't unusual on its face. Between 1854 and 1929, some 200,000 abandoned and orphaned kids were sent from the eastern US to various homes and institutions here and in Canada via train. And it's worth noting, this was not an altogether altruistic endeavor. The point was not to raise them in middle class comfort, but to provide labor to the folks toiling through westward
Mm.
expansion. Charles Loring Brace, the Methodist minister who pioneered the orphan trains, said, quote, the demand in the Midwest and West for children's labor is practically unlimited. A child's place at the table of the farmer is always open. His food and costs to the family are of little account. So essentially, he was like, there are all these useless and expensive Irish kids taking up space in New York City. We could just
Yeah.
send them elsewhere where they'll be cheaper to take care of and can do some good, hard farm labor for people. And it genuinely played out like some sort of state and religion sanctioned child trafficking. As Tucson
That
Weekly
that
put
is
it,
how it sounds.
it is, yeah. Tucson Weekly said, at their destination, crowds attracted by newspaper ads inspected the children like cattle, which is cool. And Catholics were not stoked on their kids essentially being auctioned off under the guise of being adopted. So they created their own system that would make sure the kids could be sent off to other Catholics who actually wanted them as part of the family and not as beasts of burden. So at a glance, Father Mondin was just doing his Christian duty by aiding in this mass movement of orphans. And in October of 1904, a train full of adorable little Irish kids, all cleaned up and dressed in their nicest clothes with little ribbons attached to them with their new family names, arrived in Clifton and were welcomed into the arms of these glowing Mexican parishioners. And the white people were pissed. It was unfair, they thought, that they were being passed over for the opportunity to raise these kids, and it was downright wrong for them to be brought up in disgusting and degenerate Mexican households. They stewed on this all night, and when the next morning the last of the orphans were being distributed at the Holy Cross Church in Morenci, a whole ass mob turned up demanding that Mondin get the kids back. To quell the surging rage, he gave 3 of the kids who were left to white families. But that wasn't enough. The threat of violence became such that Mondin and his staff had to hide out in the back of a saloon and then flee the town to avoid being lynched. Angry white people accusing them of being child sellers and slave traders.
The hypocrisy.
Yeah, right? Like, come the fuck on. Do you hear yourselves? Or 7 of the nuns stayed behind at first to try to face down the crowd, but eventually they too had to hit the road. One of the nuns told the Tucson Citizen, "In the street, a sheriff sat on horseback with a revolver like the other men. Women called us vile names, and some of them put pistols to our heads. They said there was no law in that town, that they made their own laws." And as you can imagine, this was super traumatic for the kids, too, who were being snatched in the dead of night in a monsoon at gunpoint and then brought back to a hotel in Clifton where they were put to bed in blankets on the floor. One child, a little girl named Josephine, died a few months later from pneumonia she'd contracted after that wet, cold night. They managed to get back to New York with 21 of the children, and the Foundling Hospital tried to reclaim the orphans that had been kidnapped via legal proceedings. But the Supreme Court in Arizona ruled that the white families could keep them, saying that it simply wasn't appropriate to see a white Caucasian child abandoned to the keeping of a Mexican Indian who was, by reason of his race, mode of living, habits, and education, unfit to have the custody, care, and education of the child. Racist as fuck.
Yeah, dehumanizing.
That's exactly what it is. Dehumanizing. And Eastern newspapers were appalled at what had unfolded, calling Clifton and Morenci debased localities and condemning the horrid treatment of the nuns. Meanwhile, Western papers celebrated the brave whites who had saved the sweet, innocent white American babies from the squalid, half-civilized Mexicans of the lowest class. This was in the papers. But eventually, even the nuns caved to
Where are we
pressure.
historically here?
This is the 1904, I mean, 1904.
Okay, so not long ago.
Not that long ago.
Nope.
Yeah, the nuns caved to pressure and said that the homes that the kids had been placed in were chosen poorly, and blamed Father Mondin for his lack of understanding of the racial landscape of America. And as Linda Gordon, author of The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, put it, quote, "The train ride had transformed them from Irish to white."
Oh, get fucked.
Yep. So I don't know, maybe it's fitting that the Irish being classed as white for extremely racist reasons led to Irish Americans being super racist. But race in America is weird and complicated. I'm proud of my Irish roots because of actual Irish people, but
yeah,
I don't claim us here. We fucked that up.